Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales. The Pacific Ocean doesn't just roar against the jagged Oregon coastline, it mourns. It is a relentless rhythmic sorrow that pulls at the basalt cliffs of Port Orford, a sound like 1,000 voices whispering secrets into the fog. For Jack Thompson, a 50-year-old retired Army veteran, that sound was the only thing that made sense anymore. He stood on the edge of a precipice, his boots inches from a 300-foot drop into the churning black froth below. The wind, sharp and smelling of salt and ancient rot, whipped his graying hair across his face, but he didn't feel the cold. He had survived the dust of Kandahar and the biting winters of high mountain patrols, but his body felt like it had been lived in for a century. In his calloused hand, he clutched a small, tarnished silver locket. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew every line of the woman's face inside. Emily, the wife who had been his home for 30 years, only to be taken by a darkness he couldn't fight with a rifle. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The Army had trained Jack to survive the most hostile environments on Earth, to hold his breath in the suffocating silence of a night ambush, and to endure the mental torture of loss in the field. But nothing in his 20-year career had prepared him for the slow, agonizing retreat of a wife fading away from aggressive cancer. He had watched her spirit struggle against a body that was betraying her, and he had fought for her with everything he had. He had sold their small Montana ranch, liquidated every cent of his retirement savings, and spent years in a brutal, soul-crushing war with insurance companies and hospital bureaucracies. He had begged for experimental treatments that the doctors said were her only hope, only to be met with denied stamps and cold automated letters from a medical conglomerate called Blackwater Maritime. When she finally drew her last breath, Jack didn't just lose a wife, he lost his reason to stay anchored to the earth. Now he lived in a cramped, drafty rental outside Astoria, surviving on a VA disability pension that barely covered the interest on the mountain of medical debt he still carried. He was a man drowning on dry land. The only thing that kept his head above water was the warm presence of Rex. The German Shepherd was a broad-chested, working-line dog with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see right through Jack's stoic mask. Rex didn't bark often. He didn't jump, play like a normal dog. He was a guardian, a silent sentry who'd been Jack's shadow since the day he left the service. Rex knew the exact frequency of Jack's grief. He knew when a nightmare was coming before Jack was even asleep. On this cliffside, as the rain began to fall in heavy slate-gray sheets, Rex didn't whine. He simply stepped forward and leaned his entire 75-pound weight against Jack's leg. It was a physical anchor, a silent command. Stay here, with me. Jack looked down, his breath hitching in the salt air, and pressed a trembling hand onto the dog's wet fur. "I'm here, Rex," he whispered, his voice a jagged shadow of its former command. "I'm still here." The letter that set the final mission in motion arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a past-due utility bill and a catalog for tools Jack could no longer afford. His grandfather, Thomas Mercer, a man as rugged and silent as the coast itself, had passed away. They hadn't spoken in years. War and distance had seen to that, but the inheritance was a shock. It wasn't money. It was a remote stretch of rocky coastline property near Port Orford, a decaying shack that leaned away from the wind as if exhausted by decades of standing alone, and a sea cave, a massive yawning cavern the locals called the Devil's Throat, rumored to be cursed by the spirits of drowned sailors. Jack almost laughed when he read the deed. It felt like a final cruel joke from the universe, giving a man with nothing a hole in the dirt as his final reward. With his lease in Astoria expiring and his bank account nearing zero, Jack loaded his few belongings and a crate of dog food into his aging truck. As they drove south, the fog rolling off the hills like a funeral shroud, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, his ears swiveling toward the sound of the crashing waves. He wasn't just a pet, he was a soldier on a new deployment. The shack was worse than the photos suggested. The wood was silvered by salt and rot, the windows were clouded with grime, and the interior smelled of damp cedar and old tobacco. But as Jack stood in the center of the small living area, he felt a strange, heavy energy. This place hadn't been abandoned. It had been guarded. That night, as the Pacific wind howled through the cracks in the walls, Jack sat by the fireplace, the embers casting long, dancing shadows across Rex's face. The dog was restless. He paced the perimeter of the room, his nose twitching, his low, vibrating growl echoing the distant thunder. Jack watched him, his old army instincts beginning to stir for the first time in years. Rex stopped at the earth, his claws scratching at a loose stone near the base of the chimney. Jack knelt beside him, moving the heavy basalt block. Tucked into a dry pocket behind the masonry was a heavy tin box, rusted shut. With a grunt of effort, Jack pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a brass maritime compass and a series of hand-drawn maps covered in his grandfather's precise engineer's script. But it was the document at the bottom that made the hair on Jack's neck stand up. A page labeled The Harrow Cipher, Page 1. It wasn't a treasure map to gold, it was a ledger of high-level corruption. As Jack studied the papers by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, he realized his grandfather hadn't been a hermit. He had been an investigator. He had spent his final years tracing the lineage of a Civil War-era shipping dynasty that had profited from defective Union supplies, a dynasty that had evolved into the modern-day titan, Blackwater Maritime Holdings, the very same company that owned the insurance conglomerate that had denied Emily her chance to live. The coincidence was too sharp, too jagged to be anything but fate. The worthless cave below the shack wasn't just a hole in the cliff. It was an engineered vault built by an Union naval officer named Elijah Harrow to hide evidence of the dynasty's crimes. His grandfather had found it, and Jack realized with a cold, sinking feeling that his grandfather's accidental death on a coastal highway might not have been an accident at all. 3 days later, the silence of the coast was shattered by the low rumble of a heavy engine. A black luxury SUV, polished to a mirror finish, rolled up the dirt track, looking like a predator in a field of sheep. Out stepped Victor Hale, the CEO of Blackwater Maritime. He was a man of expensive suits and cold, calculated smiles. He offered Jack a staggering sum of money, enough to erase every dollar of Emily's debt and buy a mansion in the hills, if Jack would simply sign over the property and the mineral rights to the cave. "It's a sentimental purchase, Mr. Thompson," Hale said, his voice as smooth as sea glass. "My family has a history with this coast. Why stay here in the mud? You've given enough to this country. Take the money. Enjoy the rest of your life." Jack looked at the man, then down at Rex. The dog had moved silently to the front of the porch, his body a rigid line of silver-gray muscle. He didn't bark. He simply locked his amber eyes on Hale's throat, a low, tectonic growl starting in his chest. Rex knew. "The land isn't for sale," Jack said, his voice like grinding stones. "And I think you should leave before my dog decides you're trespassing." Hale's smile didn't fade, but his eyes turned to ice. "Men who go exploring unstable sea caves," he said softly, "sometimes don't come back. Think about that, Sergeant." The threat was the spark Jack needed. He didn't see a CEO. He saw an enemy combatant in a suit. He placed one phone call to the only man he trusted with his life, Ethan "Doc" Alvarez, a former Army medic who had patched Jack up in more countries than he could count. Doc arrived by morning, his medic's kit and a ruggedized laptop in hand. Together, they spent 48 hours submerged in the Harrow Cipher and the grandfather's notes. What they uncovered made their blood run cold. Blackwater wasn't just a shipping company. They were a corporate parasite that had weaponized financial manipulation to destabilize anyone who threatened their secrets. Internal memos discovered by Jack's grandfather showed that the company had specifically flagged Jack's medical claims, ensuring the denials were timed to maximize his financial distress. They hadn't just watched Emily die, they had ensured it happened while Jack was too distracted by debt to look into his inheritance. Jack didn't rage. He went into a state of controlled violence, the cold, focused mindset of a veteran who has nothing left to lose. He and Doc prepared for a night insertion into the cave. The maps showed a labyrinth of 19th-century hydraulic traps controlled by the pressure of the tide. It was a masterpiece of naval engineering designed to drown anyone who didn't know the sequence. As they descended into the yawning mouth of the Devil's Throat at low tide, the air turned freezing, smelling of salt and ancient stone. Rex led the way, his paws sure-footed on the slick basalt. They moved through narrow passages where the walls seemed to breathe, the sound of the distant Pacific echoing like a heartbeat. At one point, they reached a chamber where the floor was covered in a thin, shimmering layer of seawater. Jack, focused on the map, stepped toward a section of flat rock that looked stable. He never saw the slight indentation. But Rex did. With an explosive burst of power, the dog lunged, his jaws locking onto the heavy fabric of Jack's tactical pants. With a strength that defied his size, Rex yanked Jack backward with such force that the veteran hit the wet stone hard. A second later, the air was split by a thunderous crack. A 3-ton granite slab, hidden in the ceiling, slammed down exactly where Jack's head would have been. The shockwave rattled Jack's teeth. Dust and pulverized stone filled the air. In the ringing silence that followed, Jack looked at the dog. Rex was standing over him, his tail low, his tongue licking a speck of dust from Jack's cheek. Jack reached out, his fingers trembling as he buried them in the dog's thick mane. "You saved me," Jack whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. "You didn't let me go." They pushed deeper, reaching the central vault, a reinforced iron door bearing a Union naval insignia. The brass maritime key from the tin box fit the lock with a heavy, satisfying click. Inside were sealed steel canisters, perfectly preserved by the dry air of the inner chamber. They contained the original ledgers, the signed contracts of the Harrow dynasty, and evidence of a century of fraud that would bring Blackwater Maritime to its knees. But as Jack secured the canisters, the earth shook. An explosion tore through the upper wall of the chamber. Victor Hale hadn't waited for the tide. He had brought industrial drilling rigs to the cliffs above. He stepped through the settling dust, flanked by 3 armed private contractors. "I told you, Thompson," Hale hissed, his face twisted in a mask of corporate greed. "You're a relic. You think a few dusty papers can stop a billion-dollar empire?" Hale raised a weapon, but he didn't understand the man he was facing. Jack Thompson hadn't survived the world's worst war zones by being a relic. He was a survivor. Doc, moving with a speed born of a dozen firefights, activated the master schematic of the cave's floodgate system. A wall of seawater, held back by the rising tide, began to surge into the side channels. The roar was deafening, a sound like a freight train screaming through the rock. The distraction was all Rex needed. The dog didn't hesitate. He was a silver blur of muscle and fury, launching himself across the chamber. He struck Hale with the force of a high-speed collision, his weight knocking the man flat, teeth bared inches from Hale's throat. The contractors, caught between the rising water and the sight of an army veteran and his dog moving with lethal precision, realized the fight was over before it started. Jack disarmed them with the calm, terrifying efficiency of a professional. Moments later, federal agents, contacted by Doc through encrypted channels, stormed the chamber from the sea entrance. Hale was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit ruined by the mud and the salt, his eyes wide with the realization that he had lost everything to a man he thought was broken. The resolution didn't happen overnight, but it was absolute. The documents in the canisters were a silver bullet. Blackwater Maritime Holdings collapsed under the weight of federal racketeering and fraud charges. The insurance conglomerate was dismantled, and the families they had victimized were given a voice. 6 months later, the coastline near Port Orford was officially designated the Harrow Mercer National Maritime Historic Site. Jack received a substantial federal recovery award for his role in the investigation. But the money wasn't what mattered. The first check Jack wrote cleared every single cent of the debt associated with Emily's care. He sat at his small wooden desk in the rebuilt shack, Rex at his feet, and watched the digital balance hit zero. The weight that had been crushing his chest for years didn't disappear, but it became lighter. It became something he could carry. The second check he wrote established the Emily Thompson Foundation. It was a sanctuary for veterans' families, a place that provided emergency medical grants for those denied the care they deserved. He had turned his grief into a shield for others. Today, if you visit the cliffs of Port Orford, you might see a man in an old army ball cap sitting on a porch that smells of fresh pine. Beside him, a great silver-gray dog watches the tide roll in and out, the master of all he surveys. Jack finally allows himself to cry sometimes, not the jagged, hollow tears of a man who has lost his way, but the quiet, healing tears of a man who has found his mission again. He realized that his grandfather hadn't just left him a cave, he had left him a chance to fight one last battle for the woman he loved. And when the darkness of that cave tried to swallow him, a loyal German shepherd had refused to let him fall. Because real courage isn't always found in the heat of a firefight or the medals pinned to a dress uniform. Sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do is get back up when he's lost everything. Sometimes, true bravery is the quiet strength to keep a promise to the dead by serving the living. Jack Thompson was a warrior who had lost his heart, but he found his soul again because a loyal dog wouldn't let him walk the path alone. If you believe that loyalty and kindness still matter in this world, if you believe that every veteran and every family deserves a guardian to watch their back, then subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales. Join our community, where we remember that no matter how deep the cave or how dark the storm, true bravery is always just 4 paws and a loyal heart away.